Historian and writer Eliot Wilson to join us to talk about the VE Day commemorations 80 years on today. Very good afternoon to you, Eliot.
Good afternoon, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. So, let's talk us through the significance of today, because we were pointing out ahead of the 2-minute silence, Winston Churchill going on the radio announcing that there had been this unconditional surrender by the Germans, but also pointing out in a lengthy radio address to the nation and the empire that fighting continued in Asia, and the victory in Japan would not come for a few months, and of course after the nuclear weapons were dispatched as well. How significant was what happened 80 years ago today?
Well, I mean, it was hugely significant in that, the war for us anyway had started in Europe. Obviously, there had been conflict in China before that, but it had started in Europe, and we had, to an extent, won what we needed to do. We defeated Germany, and we defeated them completely. And there had been times, back in 1940, 41, even into 1942, when that looked like it genuinely might not happen.
Yeah.
The war was not a done deal by any means. And certainly before the Americans came in at the end of 1941, there were a lot of people who had said that, this was not going to work, that we had to find some way out of the conflict, which was less than winning. So, once we declared that we would only accept unconditional surrender, we'd put ourselves in for the hard yards. And by May 1945, thank God it had worked and Germany had collapsed.
Well, again, it's almost impossible to comprehend, although many novelists and filmmakers have tried over the decades to what life would be like for us and the whole of Europe if we had not won.
It's one of those things where it really is incredibly stark. I mean, there isn't much nuance about it. We know that the Nazi regime was barbaric beyond imagination. We know what it did to not only the Jewish population, but also, the Roma population and other minorities. We know what occupied countries went through, what France went through, what the Netherlands and Belgium went through. And I'm not one of these people who thinks that British people would have been completely different. I think we would have suffered much the same fate. We would have largely had to go along with it because it was coercion. You had a military dictatorship which could make you do what it wanted.
Well, people like to think, oh no, we'd be different, but the evidence is very clear that in these sort of regimes under this threat, it largely isn't, and people don't stand up. And I have to say, one of my issues during the lockdown period was, oh wow, how quickly people are willing to give away their freedoms when they are afraid, and understandably afraid, given the perceived threat at that time. But how different are we, and how different are our perceptions of VE Day and indeed of the war from those in Europe? Because of course we were never conquered. We didn't live under the Nazis. We weren't forced to surrender to them. How different are our memories and our history as a result of that?
I think there is a difference, and it's longer than just the war, because we haven't really been occupied as a nation for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So we do have that difference in perspective, but we suffered terribly in terms of the Blitz and German bombing elsewhere. We committed a lot of soldiers to the war. Between Britain and the Empire, we put together 8.5 million men in the field. And I think that we should remember the contribution of the empire as it was. I mean, yeah. India had 1.5 million volunteers in the field, and fighting for a war which was not initially on their doorstep, although it turned up on their doorstep later on. But I do think that we should take some pride in saying that we were in at the beginning and we were in at the end, and we fought all the way through. And you can overdo the extent to which we were alone in 1940, because we did have a huge empire which spanned the globe, but we were in Europe the only ones left standing. If we had sued for peace in the summer of 1940, as a lot of perfectly sensible, perfectly rational people thought we should, that would have been it. The war would have been over and the Germans would have won. So I think we should take some credit for sticking the course.
Yeah, absolutely. I could agree with you more on that. Let's talk more about, we talk about people, fighting the battlefields, but let's also talk about, you mentioned the Blitz, the war on the home front, how this was total war for people, not just on the battlefields, in the air, at sea, but also at home. Talk us through what ordinary life was like for people until VE Day.
Well, I think for the first time, probably it was, as you say, total war. We'd seen a bit of that in the First World War because there had been some air raids on Britain. There had been some Zeppelin raids. Middlesbrough, I think, had been shelled by German battleships. And there had been rationing, of course. But the Second World War was the first time that, in Britain anyway, you'd seen a whole nation had to devote its entire effort to war, and a whole nation had to suffer as well. Hundreds of thousands of civilians lost their lives, and you had a grinding 6 years of deprivation, of danger, of men being away, of families being disrupted, children who might never see their fathers for years after they were born, who, their fathers would come back as strangers.
Yeah.
Relationships which didn't last. I mean, you said earlier that rationing went on until the 50s. I mean, it also financially absolutely ruined us.
Yeah.
But there was no alternative, of course. So it was important in that here was a conflict which showed us the kind of full extent of how awful modern war was, because you weren't anymore thinking about, we'll send the army off and it will do X or Y.
And we just see it on the 6 o'clock news. It's happening over there.
Absolutely. You were committing the whole nation to a conflict which was existential and in which there was no guarantee of success. I mean, the stakes could not have been higher.
There's been a lot of denigration of some of our major historical figures in recent years, including Winston Churchill, absolute hero. I mean, certainly I was brought up to believe absolute hero, still believe right now. How significant was Winston Churchill in that victory?
Well, Churchill's fascinating in a way because he had an incredibly long public career. I mean, he was elected as an MP in 1900. Yeah. He'd been in the British Army's last major cavalry charge in Sudan. But he had a lot of faults. He got a lot of stuff wrong. But by 1940, it didn't matter. He was the only person who had the depth of character, the vision, the determination, the sheer bloody-mindedness, if you like, to be the person who dragged us through the war. It wasn't certain that he would become Prime Minister when Chamberlain resigned. Most people thought it would be Lord Halifax. I think Lord Halifax thought it would be Lord Halifax until he realised that he wasn't up to it at that point. Yeah. And it had to be Churchill. But I think, there is a lot of revisionism about Churchill and, particularly about famines in India and all of that kind of thing. I think wherever you lie on that spectrum, it's missing the point. The point is he was the one person who was able to motivate what was a badly bruised and defeated nation, particularly after Dunkirk, which was only a short time into his premiership, and was able to keep us going all the way through the absolutely darkest times, and was able to say, no, look, this is terrible. He was very honest with the country. All we have to offer is blood, sweat, toil, and tears. This is very hard. We may not get there soon, but we will win eventually. Yeah. His sort of motivational leadership is not to be underestimated. I think the idea that he's a sort of overblown figure is quite wrong. He was absolutely pivotal, and it could not have been anyone else. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I get goosebumps when you're even talking about it. I really do. Eliot Wilson, thank you so much. Really good to get your perspective on that. Historian and writer, and great to hear from you. And Philip Ingram, your response to what Eliot says.
Well, I think Eliot brings it out very eloquently, the importance of personality and the personality and the leader that's there.
I'm thinking whole time I'm thinking Zelensky in my head.
Getting the right personality at the right time. And when you look at conflicts around the world, it's personalities that start them, it's personalities that lead you down the path to victory or otherwise, and it's personalities that finish them.
Yeah, I mean, there are geopolitical reasons why our countries go to war, there are economic issues, there are all these other things that happen, but at the end of the day, often these decisions are actually decisions of individual men and women to go to war, to end war. Very, very much so. And you look at whether there's successes or failures in military campaigns, and you analyse the different commanders that there are at different levels, and often it's down to the way they lead their troops. Yeah. Here's another thing, leaders who believe in their country and think it's worth fighting for. Well, yes. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Just throwing that out there.